The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Martinez finished her third consecutive 12-hour shift in the medical tent. Her uniform was stained with blood from the wounded soldiers she had treated throughout the night. The sounds of helicopters landing and taking off had become background noise to her, but each one brought more casualties from the front lines. Sarah had joined the Army Medical Corps 5 years ago, driven by a desire to serve her country and save lives. At 28, she had already earned respect among her peers for her quick thinking and steady hands under pressure. Her colleagues often joked that she could perform surgery during an earthquake and never miss a stitch. The base was located in a hostile region where conflict had been raging for months. General Robert Harrison commanded the entire operation with an iron fist. He was a man in his 50s who had climbed the military ladder through a combination of political connections and ruthless ambition. Many soldiers whispered about his harsh methods and questionable decisions, but none dared speak openly against him. General Harrison had a particular dislike for female soldiers in combat roles. He believed women had no place on the battlefield and made his opinions known through subtle discrimination and harsh treatment. Sarah had experienced this firsthand when she first arrived at the base 6 months earlier. During her initial briefing, Harrison had looked her up and down with obvious disapproval. His first words to her were not about her medical qualifications or her mission, but about whether she could handle the stress of real combat. He questioned her ability to make life-and-death decisions and suggested she might be better suited for administrative duties back at headquarters. Sarah had proven herself time and again since then. She had saved dozens of lives, working under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. When mortar shells exploded near the medical tent, she continued operating on wounded soldiers without flinching. When supplies ran low, she improvised with whatever materials she could find. Her dedication was absolute. But General Harrison's attitude toward her never changed. He would often bypass her when making important decisions about medical care for the troops. He would assign male medics to the most critical cases, even when Sarah was more qualified to handle them. He questioned her judgment in front of other soldiers and made comments about her emotional stability during high-stress situations. The tension between them had been building for months, but Sarah focused on her work and tried to ignore the general's behavior. She documented everything carefully in her medical reports and maintained professional standards despite the hostile environment he created. On this particular morning, Sarah was treating a young soldier named Private Jenkins, who had stepped on a landmine during patrol. His left leg was severely damaged, and she was working frantically to stop the bleeding and stabilize him for emergency surgery. The medical tent was crowded with other wounded soldiers, and the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. General Harrison entered the tent without warning, his heavy boots echoing on the metal flooring. He surveyed the scene with his usual stern expression, taking note of every detail. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the tent. The other medics became tense, and some of the conscious patients looked nervous. Harrison approached Sarah's operating table where she was working on Private Jenkins. Without asking about the patient's condition or offering assistance, he began questioning her treatment decisions. He criticized her choice of surgical approach and suggested she was taking too long with the procedure. Sarah tried to remain calm and professional, but she could feel her frustration mounting. This was not the time or place for the general to exercise his authority issues. Private Jenkins was losing blood rapidly, and every second counted. She politely but firmly explained her medical reasoning while continuing to work on the wounded soldier. General Harrison was not satisfied with her response. He raised his voice, demanding that she follow his orders regarding the patient's care. He had no medical training, but his rank gave him the authority to override her decisions. Other soldiers in the tent watched in uncomfortable silence as the confrontation escalated. Sarah finally stopped what she was doing and looked directly at the general. Her voice was steady but filled with controlled anger as she reminded him that she was responsible for the medical care of all personnel on the base. She explained that his interference was putting Private Jenkins' life at risk and asked him to leave the medical tent so she could continue her work. The general's face turned red with rage. No one had ever spoken to him like that, especially not a female officer. In his mind, Sarah had committed an unforgivable act of insubordination in front of enlisted men. His reputation and authority were being challenged, and he would not tolerate it. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. General Harrison reached for his sidearm, drawing his pistol from its holster with deliberate slowness. The medical tent fell completely silent, except for the beeping of monitoring equipment and Private Jenkins' labored breathing. Sarah looked at the weapon in disbelief. She had never imagined that their professional conflict would escalate to this level. The other medics and patients in the tent were frozen with shock. No one knew how to respond to such an unprecedented situation. General Harrison pointed the pistol directly at Sarah's chest. His hand was steady, and his finger rested on the trigger. For several long seconds, they stared at each other across the operating table. The wounded soldier between them continued bleeding while time seemed to stand still. Then, without warning or further conversation, General Harrison fired his weapon. The first shot echoed through the tent like thunder, causing everyone to dive for cover. Sarah felt the bullet tear through her left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into a tray of medical instruments. Before anyone could react or attempt to stop him, Harrison fired 4 more shots in rapid succession. Each bullet found its target, striking Sarah in various parts of her body. She collapsed to the floor beside the operating table, her own blood mixing with that of the patient she had been trying to save. The general holstered his weapon and walked out of the medical tent as if nothing had happened. He left behind a scene of chaos and horror that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Medical personnel rushed to treat Sarah's wounds while trying to process what they had just witnessed. Private Jenkins died on the operating table while Sarah was being rushed to emergency surgery. The delay caused by the shooting had cost him his life. Sarah herself was critically wounded, but alive, fighting for survival in the same medical facility where she had saved so many others. News of the shooting spread quickly through the base, but General Harrison's version of events was very different from what actually happened. He claimed that Captain Martinez had become unstable under pressure and had threatened him with a scalpel. According to his official report, he had acted in self-defense when she attacked him during a medical emergency. The general's account was accepted without question by his superiors, who were more concerned with maintaining order and avoiding scandal than investigating the truth. Sarah was unconscious and unable to defend herself, while the witnesses were intimidated into silence by Harrison's authority and reputation. Military police conducted a brief investigation that focused more on supporting the general's story than uncovering facts. The medical personnel who witnessed the shooting were interviewed individually and warned about the serious consequences of making false statements against a superior officer. Most of the witnesses were young enlisted soldiers who feared for their careers and their safety. They had seen how brutally Harrison dealt with anyone who crossed him, and they knew that challenging his version of events would end their military careers and possibly put their lives at risk. The official investigation concluded that General Harrison had acted appropriately in a dangerous situation. Captain Martinez was charged with assault on a superior officer and threatening behavior while under extreme stress. The military justice system prepared to prosecute her as soon as she recovered from her injuries. But there were people on the base who knew the truth about what happened in that medical tent. Some of them had consciences that would not let them remain silent forever, even in the face of intimidation and threats. The seeds of a real investigation were already being planted, though it would take time for them to grow into something that could challenge General Harrison's lies. 3 weeks after the shooting, Captain Sarah Martinez lay in a military hospital bed, her body wrapped in bandages and connected to various monitoring devices. The bullets had caused severe damage to her shoulder, abdomen, and leg, requiring multiple surgeries to repair. Despite the physical pain, what hurt most was learning that she was facing court-martial proceedings for assaulting a superior officer. The official charges against Sarah were serious and could result in a lengthy prison sentence and dishonorable discharge. According to the military's version of events, she had suffered a mental breakdown under combat stress and had attacked General Harrison with surgical instruments. The paperwork painted her as an unstable officer who posed a danger to herself and others. Sarah's lawyer, Major David Chen, was a military attorney who specialized in court-martial cases. He had reviewed the official investigation and found it troubling. The witness statements were remarkably similar, almost as if they had been rehearsed. The physical evidence didn't match the general's story, and there were inconsistencies in the timeline of events. Major Chen interviewed Sarah extensively about what happened in the medical tent. Her account was detailed and consistent, even under pressure. She remembered every moment clearly, from the general's arrival to the sound of gunshots. Her story never changed, no matter how many times she was asked to repeat it. The lawyer also noticed something important in the medical records. The angle and trajectory of Sarah's bullet wounds were inconsistent with Harrison's claim of self-defense. If she had been attacking him with a scalpel as alleged, the bullets would have struck her from a different direction. The forensic evidence suggested she had been shot while standing behind the operating table, not while advancing toward the general. Meanwhile, at the base where the shooting occurred, the atmosphere had become tense and fearful. General Harrison had increased his control over daily operations, and anyone who questioned his authority faced immediate punishment. Soldiers were transferred to dangerous assignments, demoted, or given impossible tasks that set them up for failure. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez had been present in the medical tent during the shooting. He was a 24-year-old medic who had worked closely with Sarah for several months. He knew her character and professionalism better than most, and he was tormented by the lies being told about what happened that day. Rodriguez had initially given a statement supporting General Harrison's version of events, but only because he had been threatened with charges of conspiracy and treason if he told the truth. The military police had made it clear that contradicting the general's story would result in serious consequences for him and his family. But Rodriguez couldn't sleep at night knowing that an innocent woman was facing prison because of his silence. He had joined the military to serve with honor, not to participate in covering up crimes. The guilt was eating away at him, and he began to consider the possibility of coming forward with the truth. The sergeant wasn't alone in his struggle with conscience. Corporal Lisa Thompson, a nurse who had been treating patients near Sarah's operating station, was also haunted by what she had witnessed. She had seen everything clearly, and she knew that General Harrison had shot an unarmed woman without provocation or justification. Thompson had a younger sister who was considering joining the military after college. The thought of her sister serving under officers like Harrison made her sick. She began to understand that remaining silent made her complicit in the general's crimes and would endanger other servicewomen in the future. Dr. James Wilson, the chief medical officer at the base, was another witness struggling with the official version of events. As a senior officer with 20 years of experience, he understood the military chain of command and the importance of following orders. But he also took seriously his oath as a physician to protect life and uphold ethical standards. Dr. Wilson had known Sarah since her arrival at the base, and he considered her one of the most competent and professional medics he had ever worked with. The idea that she would attack a superior officer was completely contrary to everything he knew about her character and training. The doctor began reviewing medical protocols and incident reports from the time period surrounding the shooting. He discovered several anomalies that had been overlooked by the official investigation. Equipment logs showed that no surgical instruments were missing or damaged as they should have been if Sarah had used them as weapons. More importantly, Dr. Wilson found security camera footage that had been ignored during the investigation. The medical tent was equipped with surveillance cameras for security purposes, and they had recorded the entire incident from multiple angles. The footage clearly showed General Harrison drawing his weapon and firing at an unarmed Sarah without any provocation. The doctor realized he was holding evidence that could exonerate Sarah and expose General Harrison's crimes. But he also knew that coming forward would end his military career and possibly put him in physical danger. Harrison had demonstrated his willingness to use violence against anyone who opposed him. Dr. Wilson decided to contact Major Chen, Sarah's lawyer, through unofficial channels. He arranged a secret meeting at a location off the base where they could speak without being monitored. During this meeting, he provided the lawyer with copies of the security footage and other evidence that contradicted the official story. Major Chen was shocked by what the footage revealed. It showed General Harrison entering the medical tent, confronting Sarah while she was treating a wounded soldier, and then deliberately shooting her 5 times. There was no sign of any attack by Sarah or any behavior that could justify the general's use of deadly force. The lawyer immediately understood that this evidence would completely change Sarah's case, but he also realized the dangerous position they were all in. General Harrison had powerful political connections and a reputation for destroying anyone who crossed him. Presenting this evidence would be declaring war against one of the most influential officers in the military. Major Chen began developing a strategy for using the evidence effectively while protecting the witnesses who had risked everything to come forward. He knew that Harrison would try to discredit or intimidate anyone who testified against him, so careful planning was essential. The lawyer also discovered that General Harrison had a history of abuse and misconduct that had been covered up by his superiors. There were previous complaints about his treatment of female soldiers, incidents of excessive use of force, and financial irregularities in his command. A pattern of behavior was emerging that supported the witnesses' accounts of what happened in the medical tent. Meanwhile, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Dr. Wilson began coordinating their efforts to expose the truth. They met secretly to compare their accounts and share evidence. Each of them had pieces of the puzzle that, when combined, created a complete picture of General Harrison's crimes. The group decided to approach military investigators outside of Harrison's chain of command. They contacted the Inspector General's office, which had authority to investigate misconduct by senior officers. This was a risky move because it meant going over the heads of their direct superiors, but they felt it was the only way to ensure an honest investigation. Their timing was fortunate because the Inspector General's office had recently received other complaints about General Harrison's leadership and conduct. There were reports of misuse of military resources, inappropriate relationships with contractors, and excessive discipline of subordinates. The office was already considering opening a broader investigation into his command. The new evidence provided by the witnesses gave investigators the ammunition they needed to move forward with a comprehensive inquiry. Warrants were issued to seize security footage, medical records, and other documents from the base. Expert forensic analysts were brought in to examine the physical evidence from the shooting scene. General Harrison initially tried to use his political connections to shut down the investigation, but the evidence against him was too strong to ignore. The security footage alone was enough to prove that he had committed attempted murder, and the witness testimonies provided crucial context about his pattern of abusive behavior. As news of the real investigation began to spread, more soldiers came forward with their own stories of harassment and mistreatment under Harrison's command. A culture of fear and intimidation was exposed, revealing systematic abuse of power that had gone unchecked for years. The military was forced to acknowledge that their initial investigation had been inadequate and biased. The charges against Sarah were dropped, and she was cleared of all wrongdoing. General Harrison was arrested and confined pending court-martial proceedings for attempted murder, abuse of power, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The court-martial of General Robert Harrison became one of the most closely watched military trials in recent history. The case attracted national media attention and sparked widespread debate about accountability, leadership, and the treatment of women in the armed forces. For 6 months, the proceedings dominated headlines and exposed deep problems within the military justice system. Captain Sarah Martinez had recovered enough from her injuries to testify in person, though she still walked with a slight limp and experienced chronic pain from her wounds. Her appearance in court was powerful and emotional as she faced the man who had nearly killed her while calmly recounting the events of that terrible day. Sarah's testimony was detailed and compelling. She described her dedication to serving wounded soldiers and her efforts to maintain professionalism despite General Harrison's constant harassment and discrimination. She explained how she had been focused entirely on saving Private Jenkins' life when the general arrived and began interfering with her medical work. The most dramatic moment came when Sarah described looking into Harrison's eyes just before he drew his weapon. She testified that she saw pure hatred and rage, not the fear or confusion that might justify a claim of self-defense. She spoke about feeling the bullets tear through her body and wondering if she would die on the floor of the medical tent where she had saved so many others. Defense attorneys for General Harrison attempted to portray Sarah as an unstable officer who had cracked under the pressure of combat conditions. They argued that the general had acted reasonably when faced with what he perceived as a threat. They questioned Sarah's memory of events and suggested that her injuries had affected her ability to recall details accurately. But the prosecution had overwhelming evidence to counter these claims. The security footage was played repeatedly in court, showing clearly that Harrison had drawn his weapon without provocation and fired 5 deliberate shots at an unarmed medical officer. The video left no room for interpretation or doubt about what had actually occurred. Sergeant Rodriguez, Corporal Thompson, and Dr. Wilson all testified about what they had witnessed in the medical tent. Their accounts corroborated Sarah's testimony and demolished Harrison's claims of self-defense. Each witness described the general's unprovoked aggression and Sarah's professional behavior throughout the incident. The prosecution also presented evidence of General Harrison's pattern of abusive behavior toward female soldiers. Multiple women testified about harassment, discrimination, and threats they had experienced under his command. A picture emerged of a commanding officer who viewed women as inferior and used his authority to punish anyone who challenged his prejudices. Expert witnesses analyzed the forensic evidence from the shooting scene. Ballistics experts explained how the angle and trajectory of the bullets proved that Sarah had been shot while standing behind the operating table, not while attacking the general. Medical experts testified about the severity of her injuries and the life-threatening nature of the assault. The defense strategy began to collapse as more evidence was presented. Harrison's lawyers tried to argue that he had been under extreme stress and had made an error in judgment during a chaotic situation. They suggested that his long military service and previous commendations should be considered as mitigating factors. However, the prosecution demonstrated that the shooting was not an isolated incident but part of a deliberate pattern of abuse and intimidation. Evidence was presented showing that Harrison had used his authority to silence witnesses and manipulate the initial investigation. His actions after the shooting revealed consciousness of guilt rather than the behavior of someone who believed he had acted appropriately. Financial records revealed that General Harrison had been stealing military supplies and selling them to private contractors. He had used his position to award lucrative contracts to companies that paid him kickbacks. The money trail showed a corrupt officer who had betrayed his oath and stolen from the soldiers under his command. Political connections that had once protected Harrison began to abandon him as the evidence mounted. Politicians who had previously supported his career distanced themselves from the scandal. Military leaders who had overlooked his misconduct found themselves facing questions about their own judgment and oversight responsibilities. The trial also exposed problems with the military's initial investigation of the shooting. Military police officers testified about pressure they had received to support Harrison's version of events. Investigators admitted that they had failed to examine crucial evidence and had allowed their preconceptions to bias their findings. Internal communications revealed that some senior officers had known about Harrison's abusive behavior, but had chosen to ignore it rather than deal with the political complications of investigating a well-connected general. The culture of protecting senior officers at the expense of junior personnel was laid bare for public scrutiny. During the trial, Sarah received support from veterans organizations, women's rights groups, and military reform advocates. Her courage in standing up to a corrupt general inspired other service members to come forward with their own stories of abuse and misconduct. The case became a symbol of the need for real accountability in military leadership. Harrison himself took the stand in his own defense, but his testimony was unconvincing and contradictory. Under cross-examination, he became angry and defensive, displaying the same arrogance and lack of self-control that had led to the shooting. His performance on the witness stand only reinforced the prosecution's case against him. The general attempted to justify his actions by claiming that Sarah had disrespected his authority and undermined discipline on the base. He argued that maintaining command structure was more important than any individual soldier's life. His testimony revealed a mindset that viewed subordinates as expendable and authority as absolute. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the military jury found General Harrison guilty on all charges. He was convicted of attempted murder, abuse of power, conduct unbecoming an officer, theft of military property, and obstruction of justice. The verdict was unanimous and delivered without hesitation. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on the appropriate punishment for Harrison's crimes. The prosecution argued for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the severity of his actions and the need to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. They pointed to the damage he had done to military morale and the trust between officers and enlisted personnel. Character witnesses for the defense tried to emphasize Harrison's previous military service and the stress of command in a combat environment. However, their testimony was overshadowed by the overwhelming evidence of his criminal behavior and abuse of authority. The military judge sentenced General Harrison to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was stripped of all rank, decorations, and military honors. His discharge was categorized as dishonorable, which meant he would lose all veteran benefits and retirement pay. The sentence reflected the court's view that his crimes were among the most serious possible under military law. In addition to the criminal penalties, Harrison was ordered to pay restitution to Sarah for her medical expenses and ongoing treatment costs. The military also faced civil lawsuits from other victims of his abuse and from families of soldiers who had died due to his negligent leadership decisions. Sarah's recovery continued long after the trial ended. She underwent additional surgeries to repair damage from her wounds and required extensive physical therapy to regain full mobility. The psychological trauma took even longer to heal as she struggled with nightmares and anxiety about returning to active duty. Despite her injuries and trauma, Sarah was determined to continue her military career and her medical practice. She became an advocate for military justice reform and spoke publicly about the need to protect whistleblowers and investigate misconduct thoroughly. Her courage in pursuing justice inspired changes in military policies and procedures. The case led to congressional hearings about military culture and accountability. New regulations were implemented to ensure that misconduct investigations were conducted independently and that witnesses were protected from retaliation. Training programs were expanded to address harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority. Sarah eventually returned to active duty with a new assignment that allowed her to continue practicing medicine while also working on policy reform. She was promoted to major and received commendations for her service and her role in exposing corruption. Her experience had transformed her from a dedicated medical officer into a leader in the fight for military justice. The witnesses who came forward to expose the truth about Harrison's crimes also faced consequences for their courage. Some received commendations for their integrity, while others dealt with career setbacks from colleagues who viewed them as troublemakers. However, most felt that revealing the truth had been worth the personal cost. General Harrison's case became a landmark in military justice history. It demonstrated that no officer, regardless of rank or political connections, was above the law. The trial showed that ordinary soldiers could successfully challenge corrupt leadership when they had courage and evidence on their side. The military institution itself was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about its culture and leadership. The case highlighted the need for better oversight, more robust investigation procedures, and stronger protections for service members who report misconduct. These lessons continued to influence military policy and training for years after the trial. Sarah's story became an inspiration for service members facing similar challenges. Her determination to seek justice despite overwhelming odds showed that individual courage could overcome institutional corruption. The case proved that truth and accountability could prevail even against powerful opponents who seemed untouchable. Years later, Sarah continued to serve with distinction while Harrison spent his remaining days in military prison. The contrast between their fates served as a powerful reminder that character and integrity ultimately matter more than rank or political connections in determining how history judges a person's service to their country.